Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for coming to this talk tonight. Just to give you a brief idea of where this is coming from. So I'm currently researching a new biography of Gráinne O'Malley. People will know her as the Pirate Queen. And that has led me into looking a bit more closely at how women basically interacted with conflict in colonial Ireland. So I'll run through some of the bits and pieces I've found so far with you, and then, if you've any questions or whatever afterwards, very happy to try and answer them. I've also put my email address on screen, so if you don't want to ask a question now, or you prefer to think about it and ask some later, do feel free to reach out and fire questions my way, and I'll try and help if I can. So that's the kind of background to what I'm trying to do at the moment. So basically, yeah, let's just kick off. So what I'm doing at the minute, looking exploring women's roles during periods of conflict, which is most of the time in medieval and early modern Ireland. So far, even preliminary work is unveiling complex narratives that underscore not only the women's agency sometimes, but also their vulnerability, particularly within the colonial and colonizing context of those periods. The era I'm speaking about, later medieval to early modern, is, as you'll all know, marked by often periods of intense warfare, political intrigue, and social upheaval. And it presents a tapestry in which women navigated their existence amongst differing patriarchal structures and the competing strictures of both Gaelic and Anglo-Irish society, Gaelic and English society, as they developed over this. It is a long time period. Ireland's landscape, characterised by the conflict between Gaelic and English cultures and the subsequent Tudor colonisation, created extreme conditions that often put women in danger of injury and death, but also paradoxically offered unique opportunities for certain women to gain and exert power. They're often characterised as liminal spaces where existing kind of gender norms and socio-cultural norms around women's behaviours and opportunities were often upended, really. And there we find certain women coming to the fore. Certain women were able to grasp opportunities, both for themselves and for their families. So look a little bit into that as well. So I guess you could say the role of women in conflict during medieval and early modern Ireland is complex, is multifaceted. It reveals both their agency and their vulnerability in a very turbulent society. It goes from about the 12th to the 17th centuries. It's marked by a lot of social upheaval. It's marked by intrigue. It's marked by physical danger. It's marked by genocidal actions. It's quite a difficult and very complicated period, especially in the later Tudor period. Women found themselves navigating a precarious landscape where they could be both victims and active participants in the conflicts that were to shape later Irish history. So how they managed these situations is often based on the intersection between their own agency, the opportunities they saw, their status, and the culture they inhabited. So in medieval Irish society, women also often found themselves at the centre of conflicts, sometimes as catalysts, or certainly described as such, and other times as pawns in the political ambitions of their families. Their marriages, what happened afterwards, their abductions, as we find examples of those, and sometimes even their mere existence could spark wars or be used as justifications for violence. Of course, one of the most famous examples of these is a woman called Dervigella, the wife of Tiernan O'Rourke, in 1152. So the story goes, she was abducted by Dermot MacMurrough, the great villain, the King of Leinster. And this is in later kind of historiography and cultural understanding is said to have sparked famously the later Anglo-Norman invasion of 1167. So she's called Ireland's Helen for obvious reasons. The invasion itself, or certainly the Anglo-Norman colonizing drive, was a good bit later than the abduction. So that happened because basically, when the abduction happened, Dermot MacMurrough was the incumbent King of Leinster. He had the support of the then High King, and the then High King MacLachlan made a fatal error in 1166. He blinded a close ally's son. He was deposed, and as a consequence, then Rory O'Connor became the High King, and Dermot MacMurrough found his patron and his protector gone. He faced internal opposition from enemies within his own kingdom and external attack by Tiernan O'Rourke, who was still possibly nursing a bit of a grudge from that incident in 1152. The result was exile for Dermot MacMurrough. The Irish annals relate that in 1166 he was banished eastwards across the sea. So that's the traditional idea that she was abducted, and that the men basically sorted it out between themselves at a much later stage. However, the problem with the interpretation of this event is that Dervagilla very likely actually arranged and abetted her own abduction. It seems likely that this abduction was just a part of the political manoeuvring in 12th century Ireland, rather than any kind of romantic elopement or a forceful kidnapping. It happened, and that's not to say it doesn't always happen, but it happened when these two individuals were in middle age, members of very powerful dynasties. So it's vanishingly unlikely that she would throw everything away for the love of Dermot MacMurrough. This is done in response to the political situation at the end of the 12th century, or in the middle of the 12th century in Ireland. The event itself took place against a backdrop of very complex power dynamics. Her father was King of Meath. Her husband was attempting to expand his territory into Meath. This expansion threatened Dervagilla's family interests and those of Dermot MacMurrough. The very important thing to remember here is that under Irish law, a woman's link to her family, even after marriage, her birth family, was never fully severed. Her male relatives still had claim to her. For example, many Gaelic Irish women after marriage did not adopt any kind of surname that was their husband's. They were known even after marriage as daughter of. They would foster their children to their brothers into their households, and many of them were buried at the kind of home churches that their birth family patronised. So there's an ongoing link, which means women are still caught up in the political dynamics of their own birth family, and this is informing her decisions. So she's very likely to have been complicit in her own abduction. So the Annals of the Four Masters, in fact, state that she was taken according to the advice of her brother, and the event appears to have been well planned out and was part of a joint effort against O'Rourke. So the abduction, the movement of her away from her husband, it could have been part of a way designed to forge a new alliance. It could have been part of a strategy to protect Dervagilla from her husband's political ambitions, which were encroaching on her own families. So there's political machinations here, and as a very high status, politically informed woman at the time, a powerful married woman, she would have been aware of this. She would have bought into this. Much of her loyalty was still with her birth family for Dervagilla, so it seems to be that. We don't know her personal feelings. We find it very difficult to find anything of a personal nature for women in medieval or even early modern Ireland, but the evidence does suggest that her abduction was a calculated political move rather than a romantic escapade or a violent kidnapping. As I've said, a very powerful woman with a powerful family. The idea that she was grabbed by Dermot and it was some kind of lovesick medieval Irish chieftain is not particularly well thought of nowadays. And look, as we know, the episode didn't harm her at all. She continues to be visible as a powerful woman. As we know, she's connected to Mellifont Abbey, She contributed to them in 1157 during the consecration ceremony. She gave gold, and she gave a gold chalice and furnishings. So she's linked. She's quite obviously she's a wealthy patron, and she's said to have been buried and died at Mellifont Abbey at the end of the 12th century. Now, she's probably the best known of these kind of women who were, fatally abducted, this whole romanticism around it. But, she's not the first or the last, because arranging for your own abduction was a means of escape for higher class women and their families in case they needed a more advantageous match. But the key thing is it needed to be planned and it needed to be approved. Otherwise, it could all go very wrong. So it's a very calculated move here. You'll see here there's a entry in the Annals of Connacht, and this man, a son of Turlough O'Connor, is killed because he abducted and eloped with Shoneen Burke's daughter. So it has to be carefully thought out. The funny thing about this one is, though, it's a kind of an ignominious kind of death. It's not a great death. It's not really a warrior's death. So there's a poem that his family commissioned, the O'Connors, and in it he's described as having a much more heroic death, and he's described as standing alone with fair stately ladies and hostages about him on the hill as some kind of heroic figure, instead of this whole slightly grubby ending that appears to have actually happened. So as we saw, though, so there are abductions. They do have to be carefully planned out. Historically, I guess in previous sources, women are often blamed for them and blamed for causing conflict. When you interrogate why that is, we have to look at the cultural context of the time, the kind of, I guess, the tropes that were informing people and why they wrote that way about women and why the blame was allotted that way. We look at Dervagilla as Ireland's Helen, for example. So immediately the cultural understanding is that somehow she's to blame for this. But abductions were due to political need, most likely, not always, and possibly quite a bit at the request of male relatives. In many of the understandings of these in the past, women are the kind of Eves of the period. Their lusts eventually cause carnage. The root of this kind of fear around the actions of these women is probably based on a misunderstanding of the type of agency that Gaelic Irish women in particular could exert, as they were still tied to their birth families. So they weren't completely at the mercy all the time of their husbands, which is very different, again, to what you see in English women or the English in Ireland, where the English cultural and legal tradition is that a married woman has basically no rights. She has the same legal status as a child. So women are much more at the mercy of their own husbands and how they choose to treat them. In the Irish tradition as well, of course, women could obtain divorces. So there again, the link with your birth family is very useful in case you need to escape a tricky situation. Political marriages, though, are important in both Gaelic and Anglo-Irish society and later English society, and they were not lightly broken by either men or women. So a great deal of thought and planning had to go into these abductions and endings of marriages. And of course, political marriages are also used as tools for alliance building and conflict resolution. And we see this right the way through the history of the colony in Ireland. From the very earliest period onwards, we see women being offered as kind of matches to bridge these cultural gaps, to create these binding ties between the different societies. In 1167, we see Rory O'Connor offering his daughter in marriage to Dermot MacMurrough to broker peace with conditions including the return of foreign knights. And this practice of using women as diplomatic currency is common throughout the period. It's important to note in such arrangements, though, again, of course, the lack of agency of the woman involved. Single women or women who are being remarried, they are passive participants in the marriage negotiations themselves. The marriage negotiations are for the benefits of families. the participants, particularly younger people, and I don't just include women, these can also include young men, really had no say. They were at the mercy of their families. It's also important, I think, to note that the passivity embedded in social codes for women and in both Gaelic and Anglo-Irish Ireland, it's important to note these when it comes to how they manage their lives and the dangers they could face sometimes, because this ended in abductions where women did not exercise any agency. We have to remember, of course, that some abductions are done where the woman is completely passive and is completely vulnerable. There's an interesting case in 1391 in the ancient petitions in the Public Record Office in London, and it's an address asking for that the Justiciar and Treasurer of Ireland, it's from a man called John Southern, and the Mayor and Bailiffs of Dublin and others must be ordered to return his wife Joan to him. So she was captured by a man called John Eustace in John Southern's castle, and subsequently she was recovered by the Justiciar, who handed her over to citizens of Dublin for safekeeping. So poor old Joan here has been abducted, then she's been taken off him, and now she's been held by the citizens of Dublin. So her husband is asking that she be handed back, and also asked that these men be arrested to answer for their actions. So there is, and you see that quite a bit as well. I mean, you see it in certain families. So if you look at, say, the activities of families like the Lapoires down in Waterford and Cork, there's a few interactions there where they have abducted women and just taken them off and taken them to their castle, wherever they were, and they're very, very difficult to get back. So abduction, in some instances, if it's not for kind of political reasons or performative, must often have been a pretext for rape. So it's not referred to really in the Irish sources. Rape is and was and still is used as a weapon of war. We do find examples of it within existing legal documents from the English court system in Ireland. It indicates, of course, like elsewhere in medieval Europe, women were at very high levels of physical risk, both around the homestead and away from it, and particularly in times of war. Rape must have been an absolutely dire hazard for many women. Many of the cases prosecuted in the English court system in Ireland involved the sexual and physical assault of women by men. In 1313 in Limerick, an alleged serial abuser of women appeared before the courts. John Lyle was accused of ravishing Clarice Fontaine against her will of the rape of Isolde Lina and the murder of Marjorie Crane. He was found not guilty. In 1306, in a case heard in County Louth, Agnes Score accused Richard Hamas of raping her. It was found by the jury that Richard did not rape Agnes as she complained, but that he beat and ill-treated her because she alleged that he raped her. He was in fact sent to jail for the beating. In a very distasteful case from Dublin in 1310, Richard Tyrrell of Castleknock, from a very prominent family, was charged with abducting and raping Eva, the daughter of William de London, who was a, quote, a tender maiden of 11 years at that time. He did not deny the charge, and he was imprisoned at the request of Richard de Burgo, Earl of Ulster. Richard was allowed to make fine, eventually, Richard Tyrrell, with the king, and he paid 100 marks as compensation to Eva for the rape, which is a very high amount. After this, Richard appears for her to have been married, arranged for her to be married to a boy named Thomas Skybrass, who was also underage, and then he made a further financial settlement with Eva. He was then pardoned. Women and girls were at risk of attack, not only in times of warfare, times of unrest, and Ireland had many instances of that, of course, not only at defined times, but basically day to day. In Gaelic areas, warriors engaged in raiding, which was an almost constant series of attacks on each other. Particularly in kind of border areas, there's unrest quite a lot. There's raids in and raids out. So it can be a space where there's a huge amount of unrest. And within those spaces, women and children do suffer quite a bit. But they're also at risk all the time. even going about their daily work. In Meath in 1313, John Simeon is charged with abducting and raping Nicola de Rochefort. He was also charged with waylaying another woman at Kells and for abusing her. Also in that year, and in Tipperary, 5 men are charged with forcibly waylaying a woman on the highway and forcing her to go to another man who raped her. Again, they're allowed to make fines. They're allowed to pay. Research in English cases of rape and abduction have shown that rapes often took place far from a domestic setting, such as the highways, in which some of the assaults I've just spoken about took place. But you know what? There's really, in some cases in Ireland, there's no, there are no safe spaces in that sense. Women are also at risk in their homes. In Limerick in 1306, various men are charged with going to the house of the Archdeacon of Limerick, ravishing his daughter Matilda and carrying her off for 8 days against her will. They fled before they could be apprehended. So the lawlessness at times evident in Ireland and its surges of violence were writ upon the bodies of its women, girls and young women, both active and passive victims in the sense as they often had no control over their fates. The difference appears to be that the higher status they were, and especially in Gaelic areas, that's when you see the active participation in abduction, because it is an accepted part of Gaelic political manoeuvring. When you find it in English areas, border areas, that appears to be more straightforwardly cases of abduction and rape. So they're often no control. There is an absolute vulnerability in this area for women because they are used, they are offered, the bodies of young women and girls offered as bargaining chips for greater political reasons. Now, one of the kind of, you know, again, one of the greatest hits here of a woman being used as a bargaining chip in a political negotiation is Aoife McMurrough, the daughter of Dermot McMurrough, and she was offered in marriage to Strongbow, Richard Fitzgilbert, in exchange for military support to conquer Ireland. This is contrary to Gaelic tradition. You don't really have an heiress like this in the Gaelic tradition, so this is a massive departure. The arrangement itself, therefore, demonstrates how women's lives and futures could be upended, as could, you know, entire cultural traditions and legal kind of normality could be traded for political and military advantage by someone like Dermot McMurrough. It signals this the arrival of a whole new colonial world and an understanding of where women sat within it. They're applying English cultural norms around heiresses to a Gaelic woman. So it's a very, very different way of understanding life than was previously seen in Ireland. So women, especially high status women in this instance, are used as bargaining chips in times of war. Women, along with children and the elderly, you know, women like Aoife, the higher status they were, the more they were subject to this kind of manoeuvring. Lower status women, you don't find as much because the stakes are not so high. But, you know, there's plenty of modern research on the fact that, you know, colonial incursions are bargained for with the bodies of women. And we see this in the case of Aoife McMurrough, because women lower down the scale often bore the brunt of violence during raids and battles. That was their vulnerability further down the social scale. To give you an idea of the type of violence that was kind of normal, I guess you could say, that women had to contend with. Just put these in, just these few examples from the Annals of Ulster, just over a couple of years that you can see. So I've underlined it there. There's a woman killed by the sons of O'Carroll, and there's 1177. Someone killed with his wife and with his people, 1187, drowned and burned the daughter of wife of Concobar MacDermot, and 700 or something more, both men and women, burned and drowned in the space of 1 hour therein. So pretty busy series of, and that's just a sample that you can see when you kind of dip in. It seems to have been particularly active there as well. There is plenty of examples in the annals. 1214, there's a record that McCarthy treacherously killed the whole family of Donald Moore O'Sullivan. There's 1254. I'm just sampling stuff that I found. Here's an O'Donoghue and Sive, his wife, killed along with numerous members of their families. The Annals of Clonmacnoise in 1315, which was admittedly a pretty poor period in Irish history. During war between Rory and Phelim O'Connor, women were stripped naked and killed without remorse, along with children. The brutal treatment of non-combatants was unfortunately common during times of conflict. In 1310, during what's called the Raid of the Burning, O'Flanagan's daughter, as she was called, was killed along with, quote, many women and children. The Annals of Connacht, again, another harrowing account, a bit further back, 1236. The followers of Brian burned the Church of Emly against the people of O'Flynn when it was full of women and children and nuns, among whom were 3 priests. Priests are high status, so it has to be pointed out. These kind of incidents highlight the extreme vulnerability of women and children during conflicts, even in places traditionally considered sanctuaries. At this point in Irish history, we are a very long way from the Con Adamnan, which is the law of the innocents. I mean, it's much older. It's proclaimed by Adamnan, the abbot of Iona, at the Synod of Bern 697. And this was the law, famously, that sought to protect women and children, non-combatants, from being killed in warfare. It represents many things. This law of the innocents, it represents the rise of religious influence. It represents the rise of Marian devotion, which likely inspired Adamnan to protect those seen as vulnerable. It's a marker of humanitarian concerns. It speaks to a society that is becoming increasingly concerned about the impact of warfare and non-combatants. It represents a growing awareness of the need to protect civilians. It also represents social reform. This period, this law sees a need to protect women and children in Irish society, which was often marked by internal warfare and violence. It's also probably to do with the Columban legacy. Adamnan, as Columba's successor, was probably inspired by his example to introduce these protective measures and also to make his own mark, and so that he would be remembered. It puts severe punishments for those who harmed women and children, but unfortunately, by the later medieval period, it really wasn't being adhered to. Whether it ever was, or whether this was an attempt to aim towards something higher, a bit like things like the Truce of God and the Peace of God in later medieval France, it's hard to know. But the desire was there. But certainly by the time I'm coming to look at things, there doesn't appear to be a massive respect for the rights or bodies of women and children. Sometimes women and children are put into the way of violence because of the nature of warfare. There's a record in the annals in 1315 where there are 4 kind of warlords who are raiding in ships. And they land on an island and they make an encampment. They're there for the summer because they're traveling around. They make some raids, and then unfortunately there's a massive battle, and it's said they were all killed with, quote, slaughter of all their people around them. So the women are actually put in the forefront of this. They are put in harm's way actively because of the way Irish warfare is being prosecuted at the time. Now, it's not just in times of war that women had to fear rape or burnings or drownings or any number of ways of being put to death. They're also, of course, the greatest killer of people in times of war and upheaval is disease and want, and people and women certainly suffered from that as well. So this put this up on screen here. It's Annals of the Four Masters from 1225. You can see this quote, and at the bottom is the kind of relevant bit, women and children, feeble folk and lord's sons were brought to suffer cold and hunger through this war. Because of course, that's what kills most people in a war. It's not actually being done to death in a violent way. It's actually want and disease. Hunger and hardship has killed more women, children and non-combatant men than force of arms. If we go further ahead, for example, a couple of hundred years forward, we look at the famines in southern in Munster during the Desmond Rebellion in the later 16th century, and these are completely devastating and widespread. And as described by English sources at the time, this is when famine was being used as a weapon of war. Warren St. Ledger, the Marshal of Munster, estimated in April 1582 that 30,000 people had died of hunger in the previous 6 months alone. It does just mean that a lot of people had died, for him to use that kind of figure. Edmund Spenser, the poet, who witnessed the events firsthand, described Munster as, quote, a most populous and plentiful country suddenly left void of man or beast. The famine is a result of the scorched earth tactics employed during the conflict against the Desmond rebels in the later Tudor period. English forces systematically destroyed crops, seized livestock and burned homesteads throughout Desmond territories in the south of the country. This deliberate destruction of food sources and means of subsistence was intended to starve the rebels into submission. The devastation was so complete that, according to the Annals of the Four Masters, it was said that, quote, famously, the lowing of a cow or the whistle of the ploughboy could scarcely be heard from Dunqueen to Cashel in Munster. That really vivid description emphasises the eerie silence of death that fell over the once fertile plains of Munster. The famine continued long after the fighting had ceased, with, of course, people still suffering, well into the following years. I mean, it was described 1579 to 83, but 1589, it was estimated that 1/3 of the province's population had perished due to the combined efforts of war, famine, and plague. So, there's no doubt that medieval and early modern Ireland could be a very dangerous place for women, and that for most women, the interaction, societal interaction, was characterised by vulnerability. They were always at risk, whether they were going about their business on their homestead, walking down the highway, or at a time when people were raiding or there was a lot of unrest due to war. In fact, they probably didn't know much of a difference day to day in some areas. But there are instances of women themselves engaging in acts that, were violent. In terms of how they navigated these choices. So, I mean, now we don't know the reasons behind them, but the decisions that were taken. When we look at the relationships and the networks these women were part of, we're aware of, certainly in English areas, the man's absolute dominion over his wife and the expectations that she would obey and protect him and his family and lands. We're also aware of how threatened women could feel from family members, such as husbands and brothers. We're aware of coercion. It's with this in mind that it's useful to ponder why women sometimes are listed as having engaged, or at least aided in, massacres, or at least contributing to them. Was it from choice freely made, which is fine. Some women certainly could have done that, or from other pressures which came to bear. So famously in 1305, there's a very famous massacre. It's when Piers Birmingham, or Peter Birmingham, treacherously massacred several of the O'Connor Valleys, who were his allies. This incident is known as the famous murder of O'Connor Valley and his children. There's the Annals of Inishfallen on it there. So what happened with this is it's like something from Game of Thrones. So Piers Birmingham invited them, and he was acting as a godfather to one of the O'Connor Valley children. Now, that's a really serious relationship in the Middle Ages. To be a godparent is like having, I mean, you have basically a mystical connection in that way, and it becomes like a physical one. So it's a very serious undertaking. So he invited them to the castle, and Birmingham's wife, she's referred to as in Galshach Shoxanock, the English woman, actively participated in the subsequent violence because they hunted down all the O'Connor families, including the baby. So she's said to have kind of acted as a lookout and pointed to where they were hiding. And there were many victims. The heads of the murdered O'Connor families were brought to Dublin. Birmingham received a reward from the authorities for its actions. It's a very famous example of the levels of treachery and violence of the time, even against those like the O'Connor families who had the assurance of the King's peace. So not only was it a terrible thing to do because it was in a godparent type situation, but it was also yet another reminder that you couldn't trust any guarantees given. It was a reminder of the fractures in the relationships between Gaelic Ireland and Anglo-Irish Ireland, Anglo-Ireland. So it's a very famous thing, which the woman is very prominent in. And it's quite unusual for that. But, you know, women do take part in conflict, and they do become part of that, which I'll talk about in a second. And because women also are used to managing through conflict, and because they were quite often abducted and taken captive, we also have some examples of how they can maneuver around those situations and benefit their husbands when necessary. So taking charge of matters like hostage taking and when their husbands were taken captive. So for example, in 1422, Owen O'Neill's wife played a crucial role in ransoming him from captivity, demonstrating a kind of high level of agency by negotiating for his freedom and thus, securing his family's rights. He was secured from McAneil Boy, one of his enemies, and she gave him cows, horses, and other gifts. Again, an example of a high status a woman acting on behalf of her husband's family. In these situations, and particularly in Gaelic Ireland, we don't ever hear about women of lower status. They don't get named because, of course, our choice of primary sources are limited. Much of the primary sources are primary sources of the elite. So we hear about the high status women. We hear about the women who negotiate the release of their husbands, who act as kind of diplomatic channels where needed, the ones who act as military leaders and even instigators of violence. These are higher level women that we are hearing about. It's not just on the Gaelic side, though. We do hear about women kind of in English Ireland to do it as well. So in the 14th century, about 1319, there's a reference to a woman called Rowisha Lelong, and she was given a reward, her and her son, because they managed to capture a Scottish enemy of the king. This is after the Bruce invasion, they got a good old reward. They got £11, and they were also rewarded for defeating various Irish of the mountains of Leinster. So I don't know what she was up to, but whatever she was doing, it was very active, and she was gaining rewards for it. Now she's described as the widow of this particular man. There's a possibility she went after these as an act of vengeance. But anyway, she did quite well out of it. So if a woman couldn't get the vengeance herself, you couldn't exert the violence, she'd hire people to do it. She could certainly order it. Upper class Gaelic women, for example, could sometimes have dowries that consisted of mercenaries, gallowglass. So there are records which show that they're using these gallowglass themselves independently of their husbands to gain advantages, and most of the time it seems for their birth family. So there's a level of agency here with these women in these kind of often liminal spaces where there's warfare going on. They might be on the borders of one region or another. So they have this agency which can often be explained not only by them having access to family power, but access to ways of hiring men and ordering violence that way. So these women are in patriarchal structures, but because of circumstance and given the right confluence of power and available funds, they could certainly navigate a path to violence, and a path to exerting agencies in that way. And they also exert their power as well through the courts, which you find in English areas. They do go after people in the courts as well, which is another important avenue for them in times of war. But that only worked, of course, if the court could back up what they had judged, and that wasn't always the case. In 1232, the Annals of Innisfallen, there's a reference to a woman, O'Martha's daughter, who ordered an attack in 1232. She appears to have ordered a man called Donald McCarthy to attack an enemy, what are called unneighbourly acts. And this man, Donald McCarthy, killed 3 men and plundered her enemy's lands, which she was obviously delighted about. Interesting enough, about 20 years later in 1253, this Donald, who was the hired murderer, he himself appears to have been murdered on the orders of another woman. It's claimed that he was murdered by John Fitzthomas, who's an Anglo-Irish lord, and his son, on the orders of a daughter of O'Brien. So that's quite interesting. So this man's life was interwoven with these powerful women who were basically ordering hits until it eventually caught up with him, and that was the end of him. There's an example. Now, the annals have different entries for this, but it's sometime around 1315. A man called Rory O'Connor was killed in the orders of Dervagilla, and he was killed by her gallowglass. And what's really interesting about this is there's a whole series in the annals about this, with this thing with Dervagilla. And her husband had come to kind of peace with Rory O'Connor, but she completely ignored it, and she ordered her gallowglass to make war on him and kill him. And it appears to have been because of issues that Rory O'Connor had with Dervagilla's birth family. So there's a whole interesting subculture that's going on here with these Gaelic Irish women and sometimes Anglo-Irish women, or certainly women on the borders, who are using their power and influence to stoke up violence for whatever reason, to kind of order these hits on people. So there's the one where Rowisha kind of this woman kind of ordered the hit, or no, she captured the Scottish fella after the Bruces had disappeared. So I'm going to go on to just one of the stars of it, of course, Rowisha de Verdun. So I was delighted. A couple of years ago, I did the entry for in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. I was delighted they're including her, to be honest, because she was an incredibly influential and powerful noblewoman. Quite an interesting figure as well. From what I'm doing, because I'm now looking at Gráinne O'Malley, who's this really incredible figure, who's a confluence of historical fact and masses of folklore. The same, to a slightly lesser extent, applies to Rowisha de Verdun. So, as everyone here knows, she's so famous because, of course, she was the castle builder. She built Castle Roach, as we see there on the screen, very formidable, just northwest of Dundalk. So she's a woman living on the border. She's a woman in liminal space. She's very active in the courts. She's very active with estate management. She manages her estates, and she built that castle. And she was kind of the first of her name who could do it. Very, very formidable leader. According to kind of local legends, she rode out at the head of her men against the O'Hanlons. There's all kinds of stories about her. She was a great religious patron. She established the Augustinian Priory of Grasdieu in Belton, in Leicestershire. She's very legally astute. She paid to not get married again when she'd had enough. So a very powerful, very comfortable, woman who found the space within the kind of Irish situation to navigate and be incredibly successful in a period where it was really quite unsettled. So she has a very unique position as a woman in medieval Ireland, and obviously a woman of tremendous capabilities to kind of navigate that situation. Another kind of one I've been looking at again, of course, is Gráinne O'Malley, often called the Pirate Queen. She commanded a fleet off the west coast of Ireland in the mid to late 16th century, and is a military leader. She's a very significant figure in Irish history. It's lots of reasons. She's a very powerful military leader. She challenged gender norms because of basically what she was. She eventually emerged as de facto head of the O'Malleys, despite having a brother. She's a very skilled trader. She's a very skilled kind of mariner. She controlled her fleet of ships, becomes a very wealthy woman in her own right. She plays a part in the events around the Tudor colonization of Ireland. She resists expansion into her own lands. She pushes back. She aided rebellions brought on by some of her relatives, but she also tried to navigate this emerging English power base. So, she does kind of try to play both sides very well. She's very politically astute again. She takes herself off to England and successfully negotiates with English bureaucrats and eventually manages to secure certainly her son's safety and holding on to his lands. So she's an interesting figure because she sees this unique blend of Gaelic tradition, but also an adaptability to changing political landscapes. She navigates within the Gaelic legal system, but she also looks to the new English systems of power and uses them as well where she can. So again, this is another woman who emerges, who upends the normative way of behaving, which is very entrenched in Gaelic Irish society, which is a very conservative, very hierarchical, legal system. And she upends this because when she's active, all the old norms are being overthrown. And this is what I mean by when this is happening, you see these women emerge who are inevitably elite women who can navigate this really well and who can manage the situations to benefit from them. Another woman, of course, is Inian Du, so Lady Fiona MacDonald. So during the 9 Years' War, which the end of the 16th century, 1594 to 1603. She's the mother of Hugh Roe O'Donnell. She's Scottish, but of course she comes from the wider Gaeltacht. She engages in battle, but she's also a brilliant diplomat. She engages in negotiations. She leverages her connections to secure alliances. She brings in mercenaries, the Redshanks, and uses them as a negotiating tool. Meiler McGrath, the famous bishop of the 17th century, described her as, quote, a cruel, bloody woman who has committed sundry murders. More modern historians call her one of the most remarkable Gaelic women of the 16th century. There's no doubt she participated in warfare and ordered attacks. She played a significant role in military affairs up in Tyrconnell. She ordered assassinations. She used her mercenaries to kill potential challengers. She set fire to castles so they wouldn't fall into the hands of English forces. But she also negotiated with both Gaelic chiefs and English officials. Again, like Gráinne O'Malley, she's trying to work the two sides of this. Her strategic alliances and diplomatic efforts, I think, play a crucial role in shaping that political landscape in late 16th century Ireland. She essentially took over the leadership of Tyrconnell when her husband became senile. She's a massively significant and massively polarizing figure. Again, incredible acumen, and again, a willingness to use force when necessary. It makes her a very formidable figure. The Annals of the Fort Masters said she is like the mother of Maccabees who joined a man's heart to a woman's thought, and that's the absolute height of compliments back then. If you were said to have a man's heart, that meant, that was basically if a woman could be like a man, that's the greatest you could be. Why so much activity on 16th century women? In part, it's because of the legacy of records. English records are pretty hot on some of these, but also it's this link to liminality, particularly in the Tudor colonization drive. It was a time of such ferocity and such intensity, and when the old norms were being overthrown, that some women were able to emerge to manage these times incredibly well, and from these Gaelic areas where women had certainly in some areas in terms of warfare, a little bit of agency, particularly as married women. But this kind of activity, this engagement in warfare and the business of warfare, and the diplomacy of warfare and the toing and froing and the constant plotting about it, it is there in Irish history. You know, the 16th century can just bring it into stark relief because there's so much of it about. So in 1227, you know, you see when there's an example of women involved in negotiations, high stakes negotiations. So there's a meeting between William de Maris and A. Crowyarrag, and A brought his wife along, and then the meeting turned really violent. But the presence of his wife in such a dangerous situation suggests that she was involved in important political events. We know that chieftains' wives acted sometimes as counsellors to them. We know that happened, so she may well have been there as that. In 1392, the wife of O'Neill was granted a safe conduct. Anya O'Neill was going to and from Drogheda with 12 men and women in her company to meet with the Lord Justice and Council, undoubtedly talking to them, engaging in diplomacy. In January 1315, a MacMahon left his wife and 3 of his sons as hostages in Dublin Castle to ensure his payment of 30 cows to the king. In 1312, Manus O'Hanlon attacked Dundalk and killed Robert de Verdun, and in 1316 the Justiciar Edmund Butler was ordered to ascertain whether the release of Moore, the wife of O'Hanlon, from prison in the town of Drogheda, where she was placed by Nicholas de Verdun, by whose men she was captured in war, would be injurious to the king or to the disturbance of the peace. And if he finds that she can be released safely, to deliver her to Nicholas to make his profit of her, and if not, to make a compensation with Nicholas for what pertains to him for her capture. So she certainly sounds like she was quite a lively character, Moore, the wife of O'Hanlon. 1229, way before, the Justiciar was ordered to take a ransom from Ivenia, who's the wife of the King of Connacht, for her release from prison. Why was she in prison? Who knows? 1439, Maguire did a swap of himself and his wife as a hostage. So, you know, women are involved in these situations. Sometimes a woman is used to try and diffuse a dangerous situation. Brendan Smith writes about, in his Conquest and Colonisation in Medieval Ireland, he's an essay called The English in Louth, and he talks about in the town of Ardee, on the evening of Friday, 9th of June, 1329, a fight broke out between a group of Kern Irish fighters in the employ of the Earl of Louth and an Englishman. After 21 of the Kern were killed, a force of Ardee men arrived and demanded the Kern. De Birmingham, the Earl of Louth, refused, and negotiations ended after his envoy was attacked. His wife, Aveline de Burgh, asked to be allowed to plead with the besieging force, and with the husband's permission, went outside the manor accompanied by 2 girls, an infant boy, and a squire dressed in a tunic and carrying a white wand. The squire was immediately killed, the countess was attacked, and an effort was made to kill the boy. The locals then forced their way in and killed de Birmingham and 160 of his companions. The countess was spared but was robbed of a gold brooch and items worth £20. John de Cusack led the posse comitatus which murdered the Earl. Aveline did not forget the horror of what had befallen her and her family, and famously she's said to have sought revenge by challenging the murderers to a trial by battle. They didn't appear, and so it didn't come to anything, but she's fairly famous for that. So she was looking for revenge, and we do find other examples of women looking for revenge. In 1333, the de Mandevilles murdered William de Burgh near Carrickfergus in the Isles of Glyn. Gilles de Burgh is blamed for inciting her husband, Richard de Mandeville, to take revenge on William for the death of her brother, Walter de Burgh, whom William starved to death. Now, this idea about women using kind of undue influence, kind of indirectly causing violence, is a whole theme that we do find as well. In the works of Sir James Ware, he talks about a story that the Thomas Earl of Desmond's death by beheading at Drogheda in 1467 was due to the machinations of a woman, of Elizabeth, the wife of Edward IV, in revenge for some words he had spoken to the king to her prejudice. So he'd said something nasty about Elizabeth, and she got a revenge by having his head chopped off. Other women are said to have caused violence due to their sinful behaviours, which caused wicked actions. In 1228, A. O'Connor, son of the King of Connaught, was killed by a jealous husband as his wife was bathing A. And more passive ways to effect change could also be used by women. In 1417, the Annals of the Four Masters talk about Art MacMurrough. They go on a whole thing about a man who had defended his own province. He was 60 odd, a man full of prosperity and royalty, blah, blah, blah. And the allegation was that he died, and it was thanks to a poisonous drink which a woman gave to him and to his chief Brehon of Leinster. And these are very standard ways of characterising women's ways of getting even, of enacting change in very kind of passive ways, much more so than the ways in which they would, hire hitmen or engage in violence themselves, which is ascribed to people like Rowisha and Inin Du and Gráinne O'Malley. They're quite exceptional in actually, apparently, according to legend and folklore, engaging in battle. A lot of the instances of where women engage with violence in unsettled conditions is through these what would be characterised as more underhand ways of doing things. So in general, though, the constant state of warfare, Ireland was often, there was often a low level of warfare, of disruption in Ireland, in medieval early modern Ireland. It had profound effects on women's lives. Regardless of social status, every woman was at risk. Many women experienced displacement and loss due to conflict. In 1236, when Phelim mac Cahal was banished by the Justiciar, many noble women were apparently captured and carried off into captivity and bondage. And it's interesting that they specified noble women. That just shows you how extreme the situation actually was. In 1236, we find a whole situation where, there's more of this kind of, it elaborates on the actual situation that happens with all of these women being carried off, and there's all of these nobles lamenting it, and it's an appalling. And then the person who's responsible for it is actually blamed for having brought the Gauls to Ireland, and it becomes a whole big thing in the annals. What's interesting about it, of course, is the fact that the men who wrote the annals are very status conscious, and the idea that these noble women are lost forever is much worse than if they were, for example, poor women. So, take what you can from that. It is a very, very status conscious society, though, medieval Irish society. Women are often collateral damage in conflicts between warring factions. I mean, there's some terrible pieces here. There's an Annals of Connaught entry in 1225 talking about a plundering raid. So in the raids in medieval Ireland, in Gaelic Ireland, it's, they're seasonal. They come out in the raids, they'll take the cattle, whatever else they can, and bring them back. And this particular one is talking about when they were driving them out, when they were attacking, the people who went to defend were drowned trying to protect them. And all the weirs, it's described as the wattles are full of drowned children, and women were caught up in that as well, because everyone went to try and defend the cattle. 1413, another attack, women and children drowned up on the shores. It was up in Ulster. So another one. So you get these in the annals peppered through all the time. In times of conflict, women not only suffered bodily, but they also often bore the burden of ensuring the survival of their families. They're the ones who are left behind. What do they do when they're under attack? The Annals of Connacht describe how in 1225, during a particularly brutal period of warfare, women and children suffered from extreme cold and hunger, again highlighting the practical impacts of deprivation on women's lives, extending beyond immediate violence to include long-term hardship and deprivation. And the struggle to survive must have been immense, especially for lower class women. Perhaps, though, a very visible role women did play in warfare, and I'll finish up now with this, is basically as medieval Ireland kind of developed and people started to build castles. So you can see that women did play a kind of a really prominent role sometimes around castles and the defence of castles, or the burning down of castles, as Indian do was wont to go about. So in 1471, Sheila, the daughter of O'Donnell, was defending the castle of her husband, who was an O'Neill, and basically she stays in the castle as long as possible and only stays there until it's rescued by her husband's enemies. And it's quite a tremendous feat that she managed to do in a period of the interminable warfare between O'Neills and O'Donnells. I think it was the castle of Omagh. In 1455, the castle of Athlone was taken from the English, having been betrayed by a woman who was in it. After her husband Richard de Clare and his son were killed at the Battle of Dysart O'Day in the 14th century, it is said that de Clare's wife at Bunratty abandoned the castle, set fire to the place, and said farewell to the country, and none of her descendants ever came back to claim it. The Song of William Marshall in the 13th century describes Isabel Marshall's defence of her husband's lands in England. Isabel Marshall is the daughter of Aoife MacMurrough. So Isabel Marshall was the heiress to Leinster and married the greatest knight of his day, William Marshall. He was the greatest knight of his day, but he was also probably the poorest knight of his day until he married Isabel Marshall and gained Leinster and made his fortune. But apparently it was a love match, which is interesting. There was a massive age disparity, but apparently they got on very well together. Anyway, Isabel Marshall was as Marshall as her name suggests. So Isabel grew up in England, and when she married William Marshall, they went on a tour of the lands in Leinster, which she'd given him through marriage, and she was there by 1208, and William Marshall got recalled to England. She was left in Ireland as she was pregnant. She was left in charge of Leinster, and a rebellion against him by his liege men broke out. And she proved to be an unbelievable defender of his rights. She defended the castles, and she upended the plotters against him, people like Myler Fitzhenry. There were several rebel knights of Ulster. She forced them to come to terms. And it portrays her, interestingly, the history as a woman of very strong character and beliefs. The poem describes her as being really displeased when William came back to Leinster and forgave the rebels upon his return. So there's a quote, and it says, "Once the Countess was informed of this, I can tell you she was not well pleased, for they had done her many a wrong and hurt, and their crimes were many. I can assure you that, had he listened to her, the Earl would have exacted revenge on them." So women like Isabel took proactive roles in the administration and defence of estates. We've seen Cal Groviar's wife managing the affairs, looking after the castle, and Isabel Marshall in the 12th century, and it goes right the way through to Inian Dhu in the late 16th century, and so on. So that's quite that pops up. The idea of women in castles and defending them pops up quite a bit. It lives in the popular imagination, and you see it a little bit in literary representations. The other part of kind of not the subterfuge, but the diplomacy and the toing and froing, that's less obvious in terms of where it sits in people's heads. It's not only it only sits in people's heads in literature in terms of castles, but the idea of martial women, the roles of women in conflict, is a significant theme in Irish literature and culture. Irish mythology and literature often featured women warriors. So there's been some interesting work on this. So you know, people often think it reflects some kind of admiration of the idea of a woman warrior, or people like Maeve. In fact, there's some good research showing that it doesn't seem to really, what they represent, these women are the kind of avatars that you should be afraid of. These are what happens when kind of women are allowed to run amok. They end up like Maeve. So they may reflect a cultural fear of female martial prowess and female kind of independence and lack of oversight. Because we all know what happened with Maeve. She started a massive war, which ended up as the Táin. And you see depictions of Maeve in the Táin and how the Táin ended and how Maeve ended. It's quite a disrespectful kind of version of her. So powerful women are incorporated within Irish mythology. It's a whole other discussion anyway, but they can often be abject lessons in how not to behave, which as consumers of the culture in the later medieval and early modern period, Irish men and women and Anglo-Irish men and women who also, they would have been aware of what not to do. So this will have informed, their cultural outlooks. The various annals, of course, that we use, there are other historical accounts that provide information. And as I've mentioned before, they focus on high status women. But what we can see from stuff like the annal entries I was talking about and so on is, and the unfortunate, descriptions of drownings and all kinds of awfulness is the effect and on lower status women, and also talking about the hunger and the want and disease. This is how we kind of track what's happening later down, but it reflects what's happening as well across Europe and in other countries at the time. We know from how women did in times of war across European countries and across areas, for example, where the Crusades were happening, about how women were kind of treated, and so that's a universal. Sometimes the methodologies change, but the impact often remains the same. And don't forget as well, within this period in the Middle Ages, in across Europe and England, you have major figures who emerge, kind of militarily powerful women. So people like Matilda of Tuscany, who's kind of there. There's people like Matilda of England. There's Joan of Arc. There's women like Ermengarde of Narbonne, Jean de Montfort. So there's these women who are sitting in the popular imagination, who become semi-mythical and who are militaristic, who lead armies and who do those kind of things. So it's not that it's unknown. And we talk about, if you look at Anna Komnena's work, The Byzantine Princess, she talks about women participating in campaigns alongside men. So it is there in the European imagination. There are cultural perceptions around women at war being active, having agency rather than consistently being victims. There is but they're not particularly always women to be admired. And they often have elements in their life stories that are less than admirable, which serves to dissipate their impact. They are sometimes a cautionary tale. So again, that's to do with the terms of the context of the culture that's telling the stories about them. So I guess overall then, to finish up, women in the Middle Ages and early modern period in Ireland face significant socio-political constraints in general, but there are instances where they emerge as leaders, and they emerge as people who engage actively and with agency in trying to control their own or their family's destinies. Their experiences are often shaped by the prevailing gender norms of their respective cultures, leading to both recognition of their roles, but also sometimes efforts to limit their participation in warfare. The experiences of women in conflict, because of course Ireland is a fractured society with differing cultural expectations. They're diverse, they're complex. I've kind of started off looking at this. It will change as I see more, as I read more into it and I find more examples. Many suffer greatly as victims of violence, abduction, and political machinations. Others find ways to exert influence and agency. They're used as pawns in political marriages. They also become people who actively participate in negotiations, who have a role to play in the future of their birth and their husbands' lands and holdings, and even take part sometimes in military activities, although how much of that is actual historical fact rather than legend or folklore is to be challenged. Women's roles in conflict, though, are not uniform. The kind of historical overview I've given, I hope, gives an insight into the challenges, the opportunities faced by women in a society marked by warfare and often political instability. I think in medieval and early modern Ireland, women could be both vulnerable victims and powerful actors, sometimes at the same time. And as I continue to explore the topic, I guess this is crucial to remember that the experiences of women in war are not monolithic. Social status, family connections, cultural affiliations, individual circumstances, context, all played significant roles in shaping how women navigated the treacherous waters of Irish politics and warfare. And I think, though, that hopefully as this progresses, women and how they navigated their world, a world which was fairly often at war, will give maybe a more comprehensive understanding of Irish history and women's history within it. So that's me. Thanks very much.